Yeah, it sounds, it looks like we're live, so
Okay.
go ahead.
Great. Good morning. Today is Friday, January 5th, 2024, 9:01 a.m. And this is the meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're going to take up our first bill of extension, S213, an act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development, and dam safety. We talked about it a little bit in committee already, but I think it will be our climate response omnibus bill, but starting with 3 components. And as I said, as the committee works on it, people have additional ideas, there will be opportunities to add to the bill. I wanted to thank especially Jared Carpenter, who has been point person for leading a whole group of advocates who have been working on this issue for months, if not years, and collecting information into this first draft. It is, I recognize, not a finished bill. There's questions sort of baked into it. There were edits that people suggested as our drafting deadline came around that I didn't get to Mr. O'Grady in time for inclusion. So if there's a key element that you see missing, rest assured that we're just beginning the editing process as a committee and as a community. So with that, Mr. O'Grady joins the table and walk us through the bill.
We know they're both fine, so should I text him?
General McCormick has been here and left.
Right.
I have not seen him once.
I'll shoot her a note. Did you accept the,
I don't. I've had a few of these.
yeah, I bet you did.
So, Mr. O'Grady, thanks for coming. And so to the extent that there are things I was just mentioning, questions that are still pending in the bill or areas that we know will get probably need further development, feel free to, sort of flag them as we go by.
Sure, I'll do what I normally do. No potential policy. Or potential issues, people that you use in the shop for sure. I don't see the Zoom link. Oh, here it is.
While we're doing that, so you're gonna be up next, with batting orders switched up.
Okay,
That fit for you?
whatever y'all want to do.
Okay, thank you. I know you have another appointment in the building.
You're double up.
It's a different.
Talking to her. I think. Where are you, what is it?
Out joint house now, or we can fight for the house.
Really, so.
I'm gonna shut to.
Sorry, house. Yeah.
Creates a little delay, don't change up that. Watch meetings, then find out, I'm sure. We think something like. Creates a delay.
Yeah.
Cool. I didn't agree, but.
Then needs.
Kevin,
And it looks like.
is it up there, chief?
It's not there. Just make you go home. No, either.
Universal excuse.
I think that, frankly, I'll use. If I relate. Here. Oh, there you go. I always am.
I mean, to be fair, it's also not, that's also not wrong.
Peter will go get punched.
I don't know what's going on with it.
I don't either, never seen that. There you go.
Okay, this is Mike O'Grady, let's say the council, I'm gonna walk you through S213, the bill does 4 major things. It amends the state wetlands policy from a no adverse effect, no net loss policy to a net gain policy. It would require development in flood hazard areas and map river corridors to receive an A&R permit. And development, as they would be defined, would be different from the current definition of land development under municipal law. The third thing we would do, it would clarify some of the agency jurisdiction over dam safety for those dams that are in the jurisdiction of the state. And last, it would establish a strict liability standard for dam breaches, which would probably case like a dam failure. And that's the fourth one that it does. So I would start walking through, think about it. The first major part of the bill relates to wetlands. The first amendment is in 10 VSA chapter 37, section 901, which is policy for water resources management in the state. The first changes incorporate the policy that wetlands shall be protected, regulated, and restored so that they achieve a net gain of wetlands acreage, and that the regulation and management of water resources in the state should be guided by science and authorized activities should have a net environmental benefit. Then you move on to section 2. There's currently a requirement that A&R revise the Vermont significant wetlands inventory maps. Essentially, the requirement is when they make a decision whether or not something is a wetland or not. But that doesn't get done as judiciously as the General Assembly probably initially intended. So what is being proposed is that instead of that sort of intended kind of immediate update, that on or before January 1, 2026, and annually thereafter, A&R shall update the maps and the wetlands advisory mapping layers on the natural resources atlas annually. And the annual update shall include integration of georeference shape files or similar files for all verified delineations. That I'm not the expert on, but I think it relates to a national wetlands inventory map. They call it National Wetlands Inventory Plus, which you'll see a reference to later on, which is pushing towards that geospatial data and its use kind of interface for immediate use. You should probably talk to someone both at the Atlas or ADS about what that means for purposes of the Atlas layers.
Quick question, so is the only trigger for updating been that when they've gone out and ground truth map the wetland? That's it, but in person.
Currently now, right,
They
but there's,
that.
so when you look down on the bottom of page 3, there's a reference to what is going to be included. It's a wetlands determination issued under section 914. That's when the department, the agency goes out and says, yes, this is a wetland or it's not a wetland. And they do that by looking at a long list of functions and values of the being provided by the parcel that they're reviewing. And then they make a determination whether or not it's significant and how significant it is. If it is significant enough, it's class 2. If it's really significant, then it goes to class 1. And class 1 you have to do by rulemaking. And that's the reference to section 915 on line 17 on page 3. And one of the other things that's going to be done here is that municipalities, some municipalities have their own wetlands maps that are different from the state. And so what is being proposed on effectively lines 18 through 21 is that the wetlands advisory level on the atlas will include that municipal mapping or municipal information when it's provided by a consultant that's on A&R's wetlands consultant list. So page 4, this is A&R. They have to provide public notice of changes to the maps. And that have to be posted in the municipality where the wetland is. And that's actually an interesting, to me, this is an interesting discussion because most of the time when you talk to A&R about, hey, where's the wetlands map? They're gonna direct you to the atlas. And I'm not a huge fan of the atlas because we have Firefox here at the State House. And Firefox and the atlas don't work well together. And so it's sometimes hard for me to work with the atlas. Other people say it's a great tool for them. It's not a great tool for me. Having an actual map is something you should talk to the agency about, of like, can they create a static map for every municipality where the map changes?
A static map in paper.
Yeah. On line 8, on or before January 1, 2030, A&R shall complete a high quality national wetlands inventory plus level. That's the NWI plus level. That has is supposed to have a lot more of that geospatial location. Again, I'm not the expert on that. You should probably talk to somebody that knows more about that than me.
Yeah, the question I wrote for myself when reading approvals. Like in the last page, there's a lot of technical references, and I wondered about how we ensure that they're durable, like 5 years from now, they're not out of date.
Right, normally we give that kind of a standard to the agency to adopt by a rule, which then allows for evolution.
Yeah.
And then once all tactical basins are mapped, so the river basins of the state, the basin plans, update shall occur at 5-year cycle simultaneously with the updates corresponding to the tactical basin plan. And then to assist in the funding of all this, and this is a little unusual, A&R is authorized to seek state funds, federal funds, and private funds to achieve all of those technical upgrades. A&R already does seek federal funds when they're available, and sometimes private funds. I don't know if you need that subsection. You might just want to communicate to the agency in some way that they're authorized to seek those funds.
Yeah, so in other words, as best you know, they don't need authorization. For instance, maybe the usual pieces like private or NGO, but aren't they generally allowed to keep those funds?
Yeah, they already go out of the state and federal funds. They to the center of the channel.
Thank you, just a definitional question, what is a tactical basin?
So there are multiple river basins. Well, let me back up even further. The Clean Water Act requires states to engage in what's called a continued planning process to identify activities in each river basin of a state that should be managed in order to ensure the quality of the water at its best level, the achieving the state water quality standard. Vermont complies with that continued planning process by doing what they call the tactical basin plannings. And then there's a literal plan for each of the 15 river basins in the state. And there's an actual planner that is assigned to each of those basins. And they update those plans pretty regularly. I have to say, and I'll give the agency a ton of credit, when I first started here, the plans were relatively non-existent. And they have gotten so much better, and the agency is much more invested in the plans and using the plans as tools. So they really deserve credit. Neil came in specifically for getting those stood up and operable.
Thank you.
Then moving on to section 3, this is where you would see some new sections of law added to the wetlands chapter. The first basically implements that net gain policy that was added to the policy for this chapter. And so on or before July 125, A&R amends the wetlands rule to clarify that the goal of wetlands regulation and management is the net gain of wetlands to be achieved through protection of existing wetlands and restoration of previously developed wetlands. And it will be a condition of any permit for an activity in a permit wetland that there be a net gain. What does a net gain mean? So that is in sub B, where you'll see that when that permitted activity will cause adverse effects that cannot be avoided, and the secretary shall mandate that the permit restore, enhance, or create wetlands or buffers to compensate for that adverse effect. And that creation, restore, enhance, creation has to be at a ratio of 2:1. So whatever acreage or square footage that is adversely affected needs to be enhanced, restored, or created at a 2:1 ratio. Some of you are familiar with the ag lands mitigation underneath Act 250, where it can be 3:1 or 2:1 or 1:1. That it's the same concept. If you are going to adversely affect acreage, square footage within a wetland, you have to restore, enhance, create at a 2:1 ratio. Just how do you do that?
I was looking for where tile drains showed up in the draft here.
So tile drains. I mean, oh wow, you just, it's like.
Oh, I need a word search.
So, under federal and state law. Farming. Is exempt. From needing a permit in a wetland. If it meets certain criteria. If it doesn't meet criteria under state law, it still is an authorized use. Provided that it meets certain conditions. Whether or not they put a tile drain in there. Is possible.
Well, I wasn't talking about whether I can pull it in there. Where are they located on the maps in this bill?
Well, they're not. I mean, they could be in a wetland. But there is no requirement to in this bill to map a tile drain. Now, the Agency of Agriculture is starting to require that. But it is not currently a requirement under the wetlands, the A&R wetlands law.
Oh, is it failure to map or identify tile drains in accordance with the statement of purpose here?
So
Maybe that's for us to decide.
I can't really answer that question because it's really a loaded question. And it's really a policy question, whether or not tile drains are in ag land that is in a wetland. That was exempt from permitting is somehow a good thing or a bad thing. That's a policy thing.
Yeah. But if we're gonna make new policy, you might wanna know where one is. Where it's located, so that you can discuss policy.
Right. But as I think you know.
Ignorant of policy and being able to base things on science, but that's for us to listen. But we won't find that in here.
If the tile drains are not, and the management of tile drains are not in this bill.
Thank you. Well, I can just speak to our sponsors about that.
Will, I'm flagging my section right there for tile drains. Of your conversation, thank you.
So we were at that 2-to-1 restoration ratio. And then in addition, there are minimums that the wetlands rules need to include for its provisions. They have to require the applicant to restore and enhance any loss. They have to incorporate the net gain rule. They have to establish parameters and ratios that could be greater than 2-to-1, but it can't be less than 2-to-1. And that they have to have existing level of wetland function at the site, the amount of wetland loss as a result, et cetera. So these conditions about how to do net gain. Then you get to page 7. This is one of the ways that you can create, restore, enhance. Page 7, line 4, sub D. It's called an in lieu fee. So if your effect on the acreage or square footage, you can't find a way to create or enhance or restore on that site or potentially on another site, you can pay into a program, mitigation bank, they're often called, that will achieve that restoration or creation of a wetland to satisfy your 2-to-1 ratio requirement. Currently, there is an in lieu fee compensation alternative under the wetlands rules, but the only entity that the agency or the rules allow working with is the federal government, the U.S. Corps of Engineers. This would allow that in lieu of compensation program with third-party entities, including the Corps of Engineers or other environmental organizations. Say the Nature Conservancy wants to do it, or, you know, in South Burlington, I know that there was one with the Winooski Valley district, and so you could this will expand the alternative organizations for in lieu fee programs.
On line 12, there's a HUC level 12. It's I don't want to go in too far into it, but what is HUC level 12?
It's basically the sub watershed, so HUC is effectively the hydrologic unit. And it starts at 2, which is kind of the state or regional, then it goes to 4, which is sub-state or sub-regional, and 6 is like another sub-watershed, and it gets down to like your kind of very localized, and that is 12.
Okay, so it's the
Right.
most granular.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's like changes. Yeah. So
So,
it's geographically closer?
yes, it's basically, so the requirement there is that any in lieu fee program, when they do that restoration or reestablishment enhancement, it's in the same watershed or sub-watershed where the wetland that was impacted, adversely affected, was located.
Okay, I think I understand now.
So it's a limiting factor. It doesn't allow you to be like, oh, I'll just. I affected wetland in Chittenden County, I'm gonna do a mitigation program in Brattleboro. So. There's a report requirement before April 30, 2025, and thereafter submits to the General Assembly. A long list of what is happening in the wetlands program. I don't know if you want me to go through that now.
For the sake of keeping going, let's, you know, what to report.
Right.
Thanks.
That takes you to section 4. This is an amendment to a specific enforcement authority in 10 VSA chapter 47. So I think most of you know, most of the ANR's enforcement authority is in a separate chapter to apply to all ANR programs. But in chapter 47, there's a specific, in chapter 47 is a water resources chapter. There's a specific enforcement provision that's effectively required under Clean Water Act. That basically that if the secretary finds that a person has discharged or is discharging waste into a water of the state, then there are certain enforcement authorities that the agency has. A couple of years ago, you added wetlands to the water quality standards. You said that not only are the surface waters of the state protected by the Vermont Water Quality Standards, wetlands are also protected by the Vermont Water Quality Standards. And you should clarify that the discharge enforcement authority applies to wetlands as well, and that is what this section does. It's also important in some respects in response to the Sackett versus EPA US Supreme Court decision, which changed what is a federal wetland. So those wetlands that may have previously received federal jurisdiction or federal protection under federal jurisdiction, some of them no longer have federal protection. They likely already had state protection, but this brings them fully within the state jurisdiction and enforcement authority for discharges.
Is this the case like San Diego or California coastal? When the case you just said?
I don't think it was in California, I think it was in California.
Alright. I'll offline, thank you.
So moving on from there, page 10, you have section 5, this is an appropriation section. Redoing the maps is going to require money. Doing the permitting or the oversight of the permitting with a net gain policy is probably going to require some additional staff. So there's $1 million, $500,000 for the mapping, $500,000 for additional in-house staff to comply with those requirements.
I'm guessing this will be an ongoing cost. So we should anticipate.
Yes, it's not, well, the update of the maps, you probably will have some one-time, first time, developing the NWI plus layer that might be one time or at least limited. But then you're gonna have ongoing costs. And even, as I think you're all aware, even if you put the appropriation out, because it's in the bill is introduced, the bill will have to go to appropriations, yes. That moved you into the second part of the bill. This is development and river corridors. This requires a lot of background. So the National Flood Insurance Program is run by FEMA, and it provides flood insurance in towns if there is a flood hazard risk. And this program exists because often it's difficult to get flood insurance from private providers. So the federal government stepped in and said, hey, you're going to have a national flood insurance program to provide flood insurance in any town, provided that the town adopts a municipal bylaw or regulation that meets the federal minimum standards. And underneath those minimum standards, the town has to regulate development, but not development as defined by the state. It has to regulate development as defined under FEMA's rules. And FEMA's definition of development is this: it's any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures and mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation or drilling operations or storage of equipment or materials. Now,
A very fine cone.
it is called pretty much kind of anything that disturbs the ground. Well, in Vermont, municipalities don't generally have that fine of authority to regulate. They can't regulate the construction of state-owned buildings. They can't regulate farming, they can't regulate forestry, they can't regulate some section 248 facilities, the energy facilities. So 2011, 2012, FEMA wrote Vermont a letter that said, hey, you need to fix that because you are not in compliance. Every municipality in the state in the NFIP program is not in compliance with FEMA's rules. You have to fix that. So we could have given municipalities the authority to regulate all those things that they didn't have the authority to regulate. Or we would regulate them a different way. And you chose, the General Assembly chose to regulate them a different way. You had directed A&R to adopt a rule from the River Corridor Management Rule to regulate those activities in a flood hazard area or mapped river corridor that were exempt from municipal regulation. And that satisfied FEMA, that kept the state and all the participating municipalities in FIP. Part of that law, Act 138, it directed A&R to map all the river corridors in the state. So FEMA's rule only applied to the flood hazard area of flood hazard, special flood hazard. And that is really only maps where inundation flooding happens. And inundation flooding is the small, gradual increase of the volume of the water until it spills over the banks and floods. But that flooding does happen in Vermont, but a more common occurrence of flooding in Vermont is what's called alluvial erosion flooding. And that's when there's these discrete heavy rainfall events that create scouring. It's not about the slow inundation and the rise, it's about immediate high volume events which scour, and the map for those types of floods is different from the FEMA flood hazard area flood. And so what you did in Act 138 is you directed A&R to map all the river corridors for their fluvial erosion hazard risk, not their flood hazard.
I'm just trying to picture, is the fluvial erosion hazard risk a skinnier path than the inundation?
No, it's usually the other way around. The inundation map is narrower and the fluvial erosion, but it's not necessarily, because it depends on the, I'm not going to use the right term, geomorphology of the river.
Yeah.
And so you should have Rob Evans from A&R come in and talk about it, because what this section does, section 7, is it requires A&R for any development on or before, page 12, on or before January 1, 2026, A&R shall adopt rules that establish requirements for issuing and enforcing permits for development within a flood hazard area or a mapped river corridor in the state. And then you will go down and on page 12, line 20, those rules shall include delegating to municipalities the permitting authority for development in a flood hazard area. Right. Does anybody realize what's happening? You're taking away certain development authority from municipalities in a flood hazard area and giving it to A&R. The municipality only gets it back if they're delegated it back.
Hot potato.
Excuse me?
It's like a hot potato.
Is that right?
Yeah. Cold potato. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize we're gonna spend a lot of time on this. Could I request that we see some map examples of this, because what I want, because my understanding for why you would do this is because if you break it out and each town gets to make a decision on this, you're not thinking about the implications of downstream or however you know, the regional watershed impacts.
I think
So
you
that-
kind of hit right on the point, is like, when you directed in Act 138, your A and R to develop the river corridor maps. We made it voluntary for municipalities to adopt them as their jurisdictional trigger for when you need a permit. And only a few municipalities have done that. I think it's like 19 have done that. And so the rest of the state is not managing their development for fluvial erosion. They're only managing it for compliance with NFIP.
And if we think back to the summer, my understanding is that was mainly caused by fluvial erosion, a lot
I
of
would-
data. It was both, okay.
So that is kind of, this is really intended or geared towards getting everyone to a river corridor map, a fluvial erosion map, which is more protective or contemplative of the fluvial erosion risks. And how to plan for that and develop for that.
So if you were a municipality and you read this and you said, whoa, you're taking away something that we have authority to do, the response might be, actually, we're giving you less work to do so that you can have a regional approach to a regional problem.
That
Which
is,
if a politician were to say that versus legislature.
that I think is actually a good way to put it. But you have to think about what that means. That means you're shifting that work to the agency.
Oh,
And you're gonna need a lot more resources at the agency to do that. And you're gonna have to convince a lot of people that this is a good thing. And I think back to the Lake Shoreline Development Bill, which took 3 years. And a extensive public participation process where you all got yelled at a lot.
I'm okay with getting held then.
And it turned out okay, right? But you needed a long-term glide path to get that to land to a point. You got exponentially more river than you do have lake. So you've got more people that are gonna be affected by this than the Lake Shoreline bill.
Fair one, you know, I'd also say we're facing pressures in a crisis. Unlike worrying about shoreline aesthetics, runoff, and I mean, it seems a much less subtle challenge to take on, but that's another political assessment, not a legal one.
Yeah, just it's describing fluvial erosion. It's not just rivers, it's brooks, sweet little babbling brooks.
I didn't mean to say it was
Yeah.
just river.
No, I just wanted to, because for example, Montpelier suffered inundation. Right, you were flooded. But what has happened in more mountainous terrain, as I said, the infamous Route 107 in Bethel.
Yeah.
Or Route 4 outside Hillington. What happened there is not that it was underwater, it's that the moving of the water. Pushed into the away. Is that what?
Added.
And but also like little brooks. Sweet little babbling brooks.
So innocent, you
Yeah.
know.
They become raging. They become raging.
You need me to swap out someone?
Pardon? No, not yet. I'm just,
Keep
we have lots of questions, so I think, you know, for the challenge for us today, is to keep going and tolerating a certain. You're gonna have to say a little harder than we want, knowing that we're gonna dig into great detail later. But
Thank you.
Senator Down, it's just really.
How would the black gum swamp be treated differently under this legislation?
I don't remember if the Black Gum Swamp was designated as a class 1 wetland or not.
It was. And when Elkhart reviewed the classification, and approved of the rules designating it a wetland. According to the law, the administration with the rules and is no
So
longer.
it's not a
Correct,
grass or
no,
wetland.
wetlands.
Alright, so class one wetlands are really very limited activity that can occur in a class one wetland. So there's really gonna be very little review of activity there. But if it's not a class one wetland, it's class two, and then you can still potentially engage in all the authorized uses and have potential adverse effects in your permit. So it will potentially require a net gain criteria for any adverse effect on the black zones.
Well, if you like, swamp is not recognized as being a wetland or a swamp.
Now, it is recognized as a class two wetland. What you wanted to do in that rule, what was proposed initially by that rule was to make it a class one wetland. And the class one wetland is significantly more protected.
I bring it up because I would like to know how the bill changes the status quo when it comes to the Blackstone Swamp.
Since it's now a class two wetland, if there were any application for a permit that adversely affect the Blackstone Swamp, that permit would have to meet the net gain standard. And any adverse effect would have to be compensated, enhanced, restored, created at a 2-to-1 ratio.
And that's in the language.
That's in this bill.
Thank you.
All right, page 13, bottom of the page. You'll see that beginning July 1, 2026, persons shall not commence or conduct development in a flood hazard area mapped river corridor without a permit issued under A&R Scotland's rules. On page 14, you'll see section 8, which is just a transition and implementation. A&R shall adopt the rules, the amendments to the wetland rules on or before January 1, 2026. And prior to the effective date of the rules, A&R shall continue to implement the flood hazard area and river corridor rule for development that is exempt from municipal regulation. A&R shall not require a permit. All right, so subsection B is called the vested provision. Vermont follows the minority rule for vested rights. In most states, you are subject to the law up and to until the regulatory agency issues the permit. So if the law changes the day before they issue the permit, you're subject to the law that changed the day before the permit. In Vermont, you're subject to the law as it existed the day you submitted an administratively complete application. So if the law changes between when you applied and when the agency issues the permit, you're subject to the law as it applied. So you don't have to do that, because that's a common law provision, and some people will argue that it only really applies to land use. But it has been used by courts, applying it to water quality, stormwater, etc. So you want to be clear which way you want to go. This follows the minority rule, what Vermont courts have done. But you don't need to do that if you don't want to do it.
Just to be clear, this makes it so the lesser standard is applicable.
That the law, when you apply, is the standard that governs you, not the law that exists the day before the regulatory agency issues the permit.
I'm still not totally like,
It's your application, basically, right? It's like you.
so if you get it in, fine, if you don't get it in, you're not.
If you get your application in today. And the law changes between when you apply and
Oh, when it's approved,
when it's approved, you still are governed by the law as it existed on the day you put your administratively complete application.
And that's what the Vermont courts have typically said.
That's right.
Hmm.
And other states, they say, hey, well, the law changes between when you apply and when it's issued. You either have to issue you have to submit a new application, or the regulatory agency has to comply with the change in that law. So,
Will there be a rush on applications? Man, okay, interesting.
so what this brings up is, if you're gonna implement this, when do you implement it? Because under, for example, Lake Shoreland bill, people, there was a vesting provision like this, and people were like, yeah, run some chair. Yeah, geez.
There's a lot of tree cutting during
Right.
discussion.
Because they have put in their application.
I don't love that.
Well, there's always transition always has awkwardness. People will rush the application date or. But I was good at
Okay, so
laws that you move.
page 15, you are coming to the third part of the bill, the dam safety. In Vermont, there's like over 1,000 dams. Most of those dams are privately held, and they don't have hydroelectric capacity. And those dams currently are regulated by the Department of Environmental Conservation. So if you wanna build a dam, repair your dam, breach your dam, you have to apply to A&R DEC's program to do that. There are hydroelectric dams that are regulated by FERC, federal dams. And they are subject to all FERC's requirements for safety and operation. And the state really has no role in their safety and operation, but there are 21 dams, hydroelectric dams, that do not fall underneath FERC's authority because they're old enough to occur before the FERC jurisdictional triggers. Those dams are regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And there is concern that the safety standards for those 21 dams are not compliant with DEC standards, or would not be compliant with those the pending DEC standards. And there is interest to ensure that all state regulated dams, so all those private non-hydro dams and these 21 hydro dams are on the same regulatory safety standard.
Yes.
I thought we did that a couple of years ago, did that not get through the house?
We tried to do it a couple of years ago, but you didn't actually get there.
I mean, we did get it through the Senate, but it didn't get through the House.
What you contemplated a few years ago was the dam registry. So, well, the identification of dams, requiring them to register with DEC. But you didn't change any of the regulatory jurisdiction of the 21 PUC utility dams. And so what is being proposed is to have DEC have authority over those 21 dams, and how that's being proposed to be done, and it could be done several different ways, is to, in the dam chapter, the way that the distinction is made, it says the state agency having jurisdiction over the dam does X, or the state agency reviews the inspection or requires this having jurisdiction over. So what these sections do, there's probably a few more sections that you have to add. You're gonna say, on a receipt of a petition signed by not fewer than 10 interested persons, to the department instead of the state agency having jurisdiction. So you're moving that safety from the state agency having jurisdiction to the department. There are, and that section on is the unsafe dam petition. When people think that a dam is unsafe, they will now petition DEC, not for the 21 hydro dams, the Ps.
The only regulatory shift then is for the 21 hydraulic dams that are pre-FERC.
Yes. So I do have an issue on page 15, line 19 to 21. The requirement for a hearing on unsafe dam petition is struck. I don't know why, because there is no default hearing. So is the proposal that there would be no hearing on the unsafe dam petition. And then why, I don't understand, because currently there's a hearing, but there is no default hearing under the default DEC practices. And then basically the rest of these changes for inspection or, notice. We'll see in section 10, that just changes the state agency having jurisdiction to the department. And again, there's different ways to do this. If you want to do it, you probably hear from interested parties to do it a different way. Then that brings you to page 18, section 11. There is a current revolving loan fund. It doesn't have a lot of revolving loans or a lot of funds in it that is intended to provide to municipalities and nonprofits and private individuals money to fix, remove, repair a dam when the dam is unsafe. And they provide that money through grants. This is proposing to change the fund to a revolving loan fund. And they will no longer be providing grants, they'd be providing zero interest loans. Although the new language does contemplate loan subsidies, which are basically loan forgiveness. Which it's not the same as a grant, but kind of works effectively similarly. The problem with changing this to fund based on loans is that there's not enough revenue. There's just not. You can see,
These gonna have to be capitalized year after year.
yes, you'll see where. Down on page 20. Line 17, is fund shall consist of the following such sums as may be appropriated or transferred by the General Assembly of the Emergency Board. Principal, capitalization grants, interest, there's no revenue source. So you will have to make sure that this fund, for purposes of loans, has enough capital in it to exist.
No, let them say that.
Well, there's no ongoing revenue source. JFO currently hates any special fund, but this at least existed before. But I don't know what the revenue source would be.
We can think of some fun ones.
And maybe the advocates that were thinking about this structure have suggestions or logic to share with us.
So on page 18, line 12, sub B, you'll see who would be eligible for a loan from the fund. And it's divided up into two categories: emergency funding and non-emergency funding. There needs to be some language changes here. Specifically, the editors were not pleased with how on line 18, the lead-in language. In order to be eligible, you need to be a dam under the regulatory jurisdiction of the dam safety program, so. The FERC dams don't qualify, the federal flood control dams don't qualify, but the lead-in language doesn't work. And I think that was actually my fault.
I wondered about that all on line 13.
Yeah, so there needs to be some revision of this language for the eligibility and I think that's largely because when it was originally proposed, it said that only certain people could be eligible. And I'm like, why would you, for an unsafe
Yeah,
dam fund, say only certain dams
this is
is
super.
eligible? So, and that led to the stance under the regulatory jurisdiction, and I didn't incorporate that properly, that's my bad. So that's basically what's happening to the unsafe dam fund. There is going to be a report on page 21. To you. Regarding, projects funded, loans made. Justification for any emergency funding, justification for any loan subsidy, etc. And then there's rulemaking.
Is there, I thought several years ago, we asked for rulemaking on dam safety, is that already underway?
That is already underway, except that last year you authorized the extension of the deadline for that rulemaking.
Yes, I remember reporting that with regret.
You pushed it out to
25, I think.
25, maybe even 26.
Yeah, it was in S80s.
I thought I had that open, but
Yeah, right, it got moved out, so I don't know, so we're now looking at finishing by.
25, January 1, 25.
That's not, so it's not, so we don't put a completion date in here.
Were these rules? No, you don't.
So,
I know you like that.
yeah, I don't know, I like it. So, think about adding that back in. I mean, to be honest, because the whole thing, when we delegate. Loosely, we end up with results on occasion that we don't like. And we have no reason to be surprised. Right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a process question for you as it relates to this bill.
Yeah.
After reviewing the auditor's report on dam safety, it felt like some of the recommendations that they made were pressing, including the American Association of Engineers increase of staffing levels from 2 to 4. And I know that that's not in this bill.
Right.
I'm wondering how you would want committee members to bring forward recommended additions to this section of the bill.
Yes, we have Rob Evans testimony from the 5th December, plus we'll have them back in, and that came up. Senator Westman, I know, is putting a bill in. So he's former member of this committee, who's not approved, so that will be helpful. I think we're teaching to a very some extent that only having one parent full-time position and that, but
Yeah, they recommend going to 4 staff members to meet the need as of 2 years ago.
Well, currently the division is 5 employees.
Okay,
They have 2 full-time engineers, the 2 limited service,
thank you.
and then 1 administrative support. So the question would become, do you change those limited service to permanent full-time and then, or are you adding?
additional.
Right.
Okay,
Um,
but I guess my question is more, how do you want us as members of the committee, like, I don't wanna start working on legislation to add to this, if that's already being contemplated, or if that would go against the process that you want.
So, well, I talked to Senator Westman about basically incorporating this language into this bill, and it's there. Hand in glove, really. So I thought we'd start by just seeing what his language is. I don't know if he's released that bill yet. Or it may not be in bill form, it may be that he's just planning on building it right into the budget itself.
I can't say, I think we have nothing allowed to say.
Sure, I'll double check. Either way. Yeah. If we're in agreement of that change should be proposed, I would rather be supposed to put it in the bill. Than. Leave it to the. Kind of negotiations that happen as a budget moves.
So if we have recommendations for additions to this bill,
Yeah.
what would you recommend?
I would say go to council,
Okay,
and, you know, it's always helpful if you get. If ideas get drafted, then it just accelerates our. Cycle of. Developing the bill, so,
Okay.
thank you.
So you're now moving on to the fourth major part of the bill, which is section 13 and section 14. The first change in section 13 adds a definition to the definition section for dams. And it defines harm as any personal injury or property damage. And that definition is important because in section 14. There is a statutory standard being established for the liability for a dam breach. Any person who owns legal title to a dam or the owner of land on which a dam is located shall be held strictly jointly and severally liable for harm, so personal injury or property damage caused by the breach of a dam. Provided that the dam has been classified as significant or high hazard. Or the person who owns legal title to the dam, or the owner of the land on which the dam is located, is not in full compliance with any department rules related to dam safety, including rules that set standards for dam design construction. So this is a big, it's a short section, but a big issue. So first, I would say it should probably be liability for dam failure instead of breach. Don't let a person say, oh, my flooding wasn't because of breach, that it goes like something else wrote. The second issue with this language is on page 25, line 16. I think you should discuss whether or not it should be or and.
for 1
Yeah.
to 2,
Yeah. And then the language for that is it says a person is liable. Right, I think the legal language works, but it could be a little bit better. But it's. It's only for significant or high hazards, you want to discuss that. And then it has the owner of the dam or the owner of the land on which the dam is located, you want to discuss that.
Thank you. Category of things I feel like I ought to know already, but just want to clarify. What is the definition of strict liability versus say?
Well, that's a great question, because that's really kind of the heart of the policy decision that you need to make here. So when you go to DEC's website about dams, and they have this handy little guidance and like, before you buy a dam, you should know all of this. And one of the things it says is that the doctrine of strict liability is applied. Well, I don't know if the doctrine of strict liability is applied, because when you go and you look at the cases, and there aren't a lot of them about dam failure in the state, they say things like this. The law governing the determination of issues presented by this exception is well settled, where damages suffered are due directly and exclusively to natural causes without human intervention, which could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight, pains, and care reasonably to be expected. There is no liability because it is an act of God. But if the damages are not due exclusively to such natural causes, in other words, if the negligence of the one sought to be charge mingles with the operation of natural causes. The injury is not, in a legal sense, the act of God. So if the injury which the flood occasions might have been avoided or prevented by human prudence, foresight, pains, and care reasonably to be expected from the defendant, but not exercised, there is liability. So I read this and I'm like, the standard right now is negligence. And negligence means that you had to engage in a failure to perform a duty, failure to exercise due care in the management of that dam. And that if you did exercise due care and you were compliant, there was an act of God that you are not liable. But there is case law around the country that says when a dam fails, the owner is strictly liable. The strictly liable means it is irrelevant whether or not you are complying with the law.
It's your dam.
Yeah. And that goes back to a case in the United Kingdom, Rylands versus Fletcher, which is kind of the source of all strict liability. It basically says when there's an ultra hazardous activity that is being engaged in and the person understands that it's an ultra hazardous activity, they assume the liability from any harm that occurs from that activity.
Right, so I can sit there and watch, and you might be our point person on this particular.
Oh, wow.
All right, so I'm mindful the clock, we've obviously a really interesting tonight.
Thank you.
There, and then all we have left is effective date, right?
Yes, and you wanna look at that.
Okay.
You mean, well,
Could you say a little more about what you?
Well,
you
think about the river corridor mapping, like. If it,
As long as you're like.
it has some of the effective dates built into the substance, but it also. If you're gonna do the glide path,
Yeah,
you're gonna have to probably look at this effective date for the glide path.
thanks so much for that, I'm sure we're gonna probably wanna make. If it would do some more,
thank you.
but that was great. 60,000 feet and 10,000 feet in line. Yep, and we are gonna lose Mr. Anthony shortly, so we're gonna. Change up our batting order. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Grady.
Thank you.
Greetings. Good morning, so for Mr. Anthony and any of the witnesses, you know, say whatever you like, one of the ways we often think about bills in here is, oh, is there a problem? And oh, how does the bill address the problem? So if you can help us understand from your point of view. What the merits are in here, and if there are things that are omissions or edits, we're game,
Okay, great.
thanks.
So I'm Chris Camp, the Executive Director of the Woodland Regional Commission and within the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, which is the entity through which regional planning board commissions coordinate with one another and our partners. I chair the Emergency Planning Committee, and I also have a lead on issues related to conservation of ecosystems. Yeah, I apologize to be at a joint House Transportation and Environment hearing at 10:30. So I will go as quickly as possible. Sometimes I was complaining that I talk too fast. So I will try to moderate that. So just in a nutshell, I think it's great that you guys are taking this up. You know, I work with lots of municipalities on lots of issues. And, you know, during the first half of Biden, there was a lot of recognition of the limitations on the capacity of towns to do lots of things. And one of the big challenges that they have is in the realm of flood hazard bylaws and certainly any kind of, even just talking about, considering river corridor regulation. They're very limited in their ability to do that. So from a municipal capacity standpoint, I think it's important that you guys are looking at really the state taking that on. I think the majority of municipalities would probably welcome the effect of the flood hazard bylaw side of that. Because even towns with professional zoning administrators. The flood hazard regulation is a fairly. Technical thing to administer, especially when you've had a disaster. And you have to do things that are like substantial damage estimations and substantial damage determinations. But particularly though, for towns that have no other land use regulation other than flood hazard bylaws. You know, for the most part, towns, very, very well meaning, they adopt flood hazard bylaws primarily, I think they would say, so that their residents can access federal flood insurance. Without really thinking about what it takes to administer that, and a lot of this is almost done on a virtually volunteer basis. I used to do this myself for in a jurisdiction in Maryland, Calvert County, and this is really technical and really hard, and when you have a disaster. It's kind of like the worst possible time to have to learn how to do this. So RPCs provide a lot of support, but the other piece of this, and when I'm also talking about flood hazard regulation administration, and for the towns that have, the few towns that have adopted river corridor bylaws, they don't really have the bandwidth to do the continuing outreach and education that you need to do so people even know that you have to have permits in the first place. So I'm a strong advocate for this. The other aspect, of course, is that, aquatic systems, rivers, streams don't recognize municipal boundaries. And to really be able to understand the dynamics of flooding and geomorphology and fluvial erosion hazards, you have to look at the river as a whole. And to be able to do that really at the state level, I think makes a lot more sense. Because that intermunicipal approach, again, what happens downstream of one town should be dependent upon the ability even of a town to even have a conversation about doing something about flood hazard and fluvial erosion concerns, or removing dams or other things. So really taking a more holistic approach and moving that regulatory regime to the state where you've got the technical capacity, hopefully can build. You certainly have the technical capacity and hopefully build the staff capacity to do it at a professional level is important. So I think you're off to a great start with the bill, more than a great start. One thing that I'll also note, somebody mentioned about the brooks. The flooding frequency that we're seeing and the intensity, in 2021, when the rest of the state was in drought, we had our 2023 in our region, we had an excessively wet summer, maybe historically wet. And we got like maybe 6 inches of rain. This happened a lot in 2023 in a very brief period of time. And in some places, we saw flooding that was worse than Irene. And the small tributaries, the small headwater streams exploded. And even drainages that generally do not flood, they were running into homes that had probably never historically experienced flooding before. And it wasn't just water, it was debris. And so we're dealing with new behaviors. I would encourage you to speak with the geologist at Norwich University. I spoke to the American Society for Civil Engineers, Geotech Institute. And he basically said that we're living through a new geologic epoch that humans alive today, probably in the past, have never experienced before. And so as we think about, river corridor and allowing brooks and rivers to move beyond what I think was originally thought about when river corridor statute was first adopted, we really need to think about how and then we may not have a good solution right now. We really need to think about how do we treat these smaller tributaries, because they are causing incredible damage to homes, to businesses, also to transportation infrastructure, and they can be incredibly dangerous. And it really, getting past the 30 by 30, 50 by 50, I forget the bill number, working on the aquatic system group on that, but we really need to think about, this really all, these things are all interrelated, right? So we really need to be thinking about headwaters ecosystem protection. It's not just a buffer between a stream and letting things move. It is maintaining vegetation, reducing impervious surface. It's everything that contributes to the flow of water into these smaller tributaries, and everything else that those things are carrying that ultimately wind up in the bigger rivers, right? Because the other thing that I'm seeing in real world, because again, just the frequency with which we've had events in our region. In the, kind of the alluvial fans, once the streams and rivers come out of the steeper ground. The sediment loading that I'm seeing, is really frightening. And so that we need to really think about these dynamics that are at work. And I know it's gonna be a hard conversation. I know it's gonna put you guys in a difficult position. I was around for the lake and pond buffer discussion. But this is really an existential issue. And, this is one of the reasons why I would recommend, I think my colleagues among the other RPCs recommend it, is this is life safety policy at this point. But it also, one thing I would, if there's room for this, I would encourage you to possibly think about a more holistic water strategy, because right now we've got the stratified approach where we deal with the flood, river corridor hazards, and water quality and ecosystem health. Is there a way to look at these more in a more kind of holistic, systemic approach about how all of these things interrelate? Because it's not just how the rivers move, it's also how much vegetation, what kind of vegetation, maintaining that vegetation. Rocks do a really good job dispersing energy, but it's roots that hold ground. So thinking about this as a more kind of holistic system. And so, in a nutshell, I think you're on a really good track. Quick thing on dams, we're working with a number of towns, including 2 on the West River, Londonderry and Weston, both of which have the kind of the last remaining large dam, other than the flood control dams in Townsend and Jamaica, the last kind of, non-functioning dams on the west.
Like a mill town and towns kind of.
Exactly, Weston, and then, they're old mill ponds, exactly, and, it's really hard for towns to have these conversations, but if it's possible to work into the bill. A provision that maybe A&R looks at what they've already got in the existing basin plans and identifies. Strategically, what dams they may want to go ahead and do an assessment on, how do those things affect the flood levels, both upstream and down. If they could just do that to help move towns ahead in that conversation, so they're not hunting for grants to even have that conversation, but remember, it could take years for a town to decide to have a conversation, much less have one. Then they have to apply for a grant, they have to figure out how to administer the grant, and that can take a long time. If there are already, and the state probably already knows which ones these are, if there are critical dams that they really need to kind of help move the conversation along more quickly. I could work on looking and see like maybe what the language looks like, but if the state could just go ahead and commission the flood, the effects on flooding upstream and down, and just get that out there, the towns can at least be more informed in these conversations. It's not just towns, like in the case of Weston, it's a nonprofit that owns that dam.
Yeah.
But it has massive effects on the village itself, and then also.
Because I've seen that one, but I don't know how it works in heavy rain in front of it. Is that it backs up a lot of water? I mean, is it the impoundment that it does, or is it that?
It's an unnecessary impediment, because where you have most dams, you already have usually have waterfalls, right? And at the West Dam, you can stand on, you can look right there and you can see the toe of the ledge.
Yeah.
So not only do you have dams, but then you also have the sediment pooling up above. And so you decrease access within the channel.
Yeah.
And then in some cases, you're decreasing access and adding further sedimentation to the floodplain up above.
Yeah.
So ideally, what you want to do is develop an entire floodplain access, headwater protection. You want to look at that as a system, but discreetly, you can look and see, you can model what effect does that dam or does it not have on flooding upstream and down. Ron Rose, I don't want to put him on Ron Rose from Necker Conservancy. He was involved in a conversation with us with Weston, but just, he's got a lot of experience, and he was thinking possibly in Weston, we may be talking a 3 or 4 foot difference,
Yeah.
which is huge.
Yeah.
So to the extent that the state can take that on and not rely on the towns or a nonprofit or somebody else having to do it, there's a big stick now with the new dam safety regs. That's gonna make a lot of nonprofits and town and dams kind of figure out, well, maybe we should remove these things. But to the extent that modeling can already be done, that would be great.
So in Weston, is it causing flooding up Route 100 to the north? Because it's backing up into.
It's probably exacerbating both. I'm not a river scientist or engineer, but
Alright.
I think that's the concern.
And is the concern in these towns, that, you know, like people are used to having a mill pond and just failing it.
It's changed, right? And then I know, you know, we had a grant, we actually got to the National Dome for the Arts. They had a choreographer come and help Londonderry have a conversation about this in a different and more friendly way. And a lot of people like the sound of the water running over the dam. Well, there's actually probably a waterfall under there that's gonna make the same sound. There are people who like the pool because it's always been there. Even if you notice those pools are probably deep, if you might say to your knees, but those things sometimes are less than a foot deep.
Right.
Because they're so full of sediment. So anyway, I'm probably need to head over to the House hearing, but having answered quick questions, I can always come back.
To make
The dam you're talking about in Weston, you're talking about the one at the mill,
Right,
right upstream from the,
yep,
the town. Yeah, because there was flooding right downstream
We got it.
from that dam.
and
And that was a little of the most damage actually.
right, but into the systems approach that I was talking about. Removing the dam is one piece of it, then you have an undersized town bridge right below that then. Debris dams form and it diverts the river around and through the village, like through the school
Yeah.
and.
Is that what happens?
That's-
Yeah, but
The bridge becoming a dam.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but then you also have a similar circumstance just downstream in Londonderry. Where you've got another dam right underneath the V-Trans bridge, that redirects the flood off and away, and then also the fire department, that's my understanding, is right above there. The water gets backed up into what could be a wet meadow, and so it probably exacerbates that flooding. And so, but Weston, it's awesome because we had suggested Weston and Londonderry start having more of a joint conversation. So really close, you know how it is, you know, sometimes towns can be adjacent, but not necessarily talk to each other. They're starting to talk to each other and they're recognizing that have this continuity. What we would like to the region, but we'd love to see having more at the state level, is treat that as a comprehensive corridor. And then also the town's planning commissions and all work more together on everything from flood resilience, how do we grow the villages away, what infrastructure do we need, but also even like have what we're proposing, like a 5-town housing conversation, but all of this ultimately relates to where do you grow away from the threats and how do you do that? What infrastructure investment do you need to make? And so all of this is of a whole, right? But this bill, to my mind, establishes important kind of foundational regulatory framework where we can at least deal with the rivers and streams and all more effectively and more professionally.
Mr. Chair, can I just say, I really appreciate you bringing up this example, and we have had multiple meetings in Weston, and what we heard loud and clear was. We don't know what to do next because we don't know what's gonna happen with these dams. And that leads to a ton of problems for any community, so I do hope that we can do something this year to at least give some assurity for any future development in those communities.
If I can say one thing to that, so we can guide them through this, but this takes time. This isn't like a fly in for 30 minutes every couple of weeks. I mean, this is an ongoing conversations and give us the flexibility to have the conversations that the towns need to have. And too often when we get grants, we're kind of micromanaged that dictating what kind of conversation we have on what time frame. We need to work on this, on the time frame of the towns, give us the flexibility to bring in other partners in the conversations, because it's all gonna be different depending on who we work with. But it could be a great model. I think it's already becoming a great model, and through MTAP and other things where there's more flexibility in that program, so I think we're gonna have more support to make a lot of conversations in Weston and Londonderry happen, but it's kind of emerging, but honestly, I mean, a lot of the response kind of I'm seeing in post the July flood rough to post Irene, we're moving faster and these things are happening faster.
You have time for two really quick questions,
Well, I think-
Senator Watson, that's Senator McCollum.
I think my question might be more of a Michael O'Grady question, so just respecting that you probably have to go. So I'm just gonna ask your time for.
Question or observation?
Question,
Okay,
okay, and for this is this Weston specific, but I presume would have implications for other towns as well. Are you suggesting that the dam just shouldn't be there? Or that we need to do something to, for example, an escape?
I think the basin plan, I mean, so this is another, that's kind of bifurcation, right, of all these different things, the basin plan, right, the water quality plan. And there's a river corridor plan, there are all kinds of reasons why that dam probably shouldn't be there. But yeah, I mean, I'm educated landscape architect, but have some understanding of flow dynamics, but I would say, yeah, it probably shouldn't be there. Generally speaking, dams where they are no longer useful, probably don't need to be there for all kinds of, from, you know, for flood reasons, but also, you know, ecological, habitat and other reasons too.
That was restoring that whole mill. Danger.
Yeah. And to my mind, what I suggest to them is, part of the interpretation could actually be, you know, a dam used to be here. This is, you know, it was foundational to this town's founding.
Yeah.
Now removing that dam may continue to allow this village to exist. Because in a time of climate change, while maybe aesthetically pleasing, it is endangering the existence of the town office, the school, and other houses, other businesses and homes downstream. And in the event of catastrophic failure, people would lose their lives. So, I mean, I think that's the story that we tell.
interesting turning.
That is-
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you guys, I'm happy to come back.
All right, we'll look forward